In the winter of 1883, a French carpenter named Henri Augustin Vollard was among the last workers permitted inside the completed iron armature of the Statue of Liberty, before the copper skin was applied over its frame. He was 31 years old, a joiner by trade who had been recruited from a workshop in Rouen to work on the wooden scaffolding and access platforms that allowed Gustave Eiffel's construction team to rivet the iron skeleton together from the inside. He was not a famous man, and he was not supposed to be paying attention to anything other than the scaffolding he was assembling and removing as the frame rose floor by floor through the Parisian warehouse on the Rue de Chazelle where the statue was pre-constructed. He was, however, paying attention. And in the last months of his life, he died in Lyon in 1931. At the age of 79, he dictated an account to his daughter of what the inside of the armature looked like before the copper was sealed over it, and what he had found on the interior face of one of the primary iron ribs in the statue's upper torso, and what he believed that finding meant. His daughter kept the account. Her granddaughter donated it to a local archive in Lyon in 1978, and the archive cataloged it under the heading Personal Recollections, Vollard Family, 19th Century, without reading closely enough to understand what it described. I came to this through Eiffel. I had been following the engineering history of the Statue of Liberty's iron armature, specifically the relationship between the construction techniques Eiffel used in the Rue de Chazelle's warehouse and the techniques he would deploy in the Eiffel Tower 6 years later, when I found a reference in a French engineering history monograph to a class of workers described as inside men, jointers and scaffolders who worked in the interior of the armature during assembly and who were, the monograph noted, deliberately not retained for the exterior copper application work. Deliberately not retained. The monograph did not explain what that phrase meant in practice or why the distinction had been made. It cited no source. I spent 18 months finding the source, and what I found was not an engineering decision about labor specialization. It was a personnel decision about what certain workers had seen and a quiet institutional choice about who should continue to have access to the structure's completion. By the time you reach the end of what I am going to tell you, you will understand that the inside of the Statue of Liberty's iron armature, in the period before the copper skin was applied, showed features that Eiffel's engineering team had not designed and had not documented in the construction specifications, and that Henri Vollard was one of a small number of workers who observed those features at close range, and who recorded what they saw in documents that were never intended to enter any official archive. What Vollard found on the interior face of an iron rib in the statue's upper torso is described in his dictated account with the precision of a carpenter who understood structural materials and who understood, with equal clarity, that what he was describing was not a feature of the construction. It was something the construction had revealed. Consider what the inside of the Statue of Liberty's armature actually looked like during assembly. Because the standard account of the statue's construction presents the armature as a pure engineering product, Eiffel's latticed iron skeleton, designed to flex with the copper skin in response to thermal expansion and wind load, assembled with extraordinary precision in a Paris warehouse before disassembly and shipping to New York. This account is correct as far as it goes. The armature is an engineering achievement, but the armature was assembled around a central iron pylon, and the pylon was sunk into a foundation, and the foundation in Paris was itself sunk into a warehouse floor that had been excavated to the depth required for the pylon's anchorage. The excavation for the pylon's Paris foundation went down 14 feet below the warehouse floor level. And at the bottom of that excavation, according to a document I found in the archives of the Compagnie des Établissements Eiffel, the corporate records now held at the Institut National des Sciences et Techniques Nucléaires in Saclay, The excavation crew encountered dressed stone at a depth inconsistent with any prior construction on that site. The site had been a warehouse since the 1840s. The stones were not from the warehouse. The excavation note, filed by the site foreman in the spring of 1882, describes them as large, regular, and showing surface treatment he did not recognize. They were too deep in the excavation to remove without compromising the foundation schedule. The pylon was poured over them. The decision to not retain the inside men for the exterior copper application work is documented in the labor records of the Compagnie des Établissements Eiffel, which recorded the employment terms of every worker on the project. What those records show is that the inside men, a group of approximately 34 workers who had worked inside the armature during its assembly phase, were paid off in a single batch payment in April of 1883, the month the armature assembly was formally declared complete. The standard practice for a project of this scale would have been to transition workers from one phase to the next as the work required, retaining those whose skills were applicable and releasing those whose skills were not. Copper application required a different set of skills than iron scaffolding, so some turnover was expected. What was not expected, in the standard practice, was the complete and simultaneous release of the entire inside workforce on the same day, before the copper application had begun. Without any retention of even the supervisory inside workers, who knew the armature's configuration and could have provided useful guidance during the copper installation. The complete and simultaneous release of all 34 inside workers on the same day, 3 weeks before the copper application began, is not a standard labor transition. It is a clearance. And then the armature was built above the pylon, and the inside men, the scaffolders and joiners, assembled the access platforms that allowed the riveting crews to work inside the rising iron lattice. And what those men saw, at close range and over many months, was not simply the underside of an engineering project. The iron bars and lattice members that Eiffel's team had fabricated in the workshop had been manufactured to specification, transported to the site, and bolted into position according to the engineering drawings. But the engineering drawings, as any construction project of that complexity would generate, left a large number of interior surfaces effectively inaccessible to inspection once the assembly was complete. The inside men, on their scaffolding, had access to those surfaces throughout the assembly. They were the last workers who would ever see certain parts of the armature's interior, because once the copper was applied, those surfaces would be permanently sealed inside the structure. This is the part I keep returning to. Vollard's dictated account describes the work of his final months inside the armature in 1882 and 1883 in a language that is practical and unexaggerated for most of its length. The weight of the scaffold planks, the cold inside the structure in winter, the noise of the riveting that made conversation impossible when the crews were working above. He describes his colleagues, the routines of the work, the phased removal of scaffolding sections as the copper application proceeded, and each zone of the interior was permanently closed. He is a precise observer and a measured narrator, the qualities that make a craftsman's account reliable. And then, in a passage beginning on page 7 of his daughter's transcription, his register changes. Not dramatically, not toward speculation, toward a language that is still precise and still measured, but reaching for words that the vocabulary of his trade does not supply. I have read enough of these accounts now, from surgeons, from engineers, from geologists, from telegraph operators, to recognize the register change when it comes, and to understand that it is never a sign of unreliability. It is the opposite. It is what a careful observer sounds like when they have encountered something their training did not prepare them to name, and they are committed enough to the truth of their observation that they will use inadequate language rather than no language at all. Vollard's inadequate language, on page 7, is the most honest thing in the document, and it describes something that was sealed inside the most recognized statue in the world in the winter of 1883, and has not been examined since. He describes the primary iron rib that runs along the interior of the statue's left side, at the level of the figure's upper torso, as having a surface on its interior face. The face that was sealed against a secondary lattice member, that he noticed first in passing while fixing a scaffold anchor, and then returned to examine more carefully over the following 2 days. He describes the surface as showing a pattern, not a manufacturing pattern, not the marks left by the rolling mill that had produced the iron bar, not the surface character he recognized from hundreds of other iron members he had worked near. He describes it as regular. He uses that word 3 times, just as the Army Corps surveyor in the Hoover Dam Drainage Gallery used the word worked 3 times, because it is the most precise word a craftsman has for the distinction between a feature that emerges from a natural or mechanical process and a feature that reflects an intention. Regular, not random. Not mechanical. Regular in the way that things are regular when they carry meaning or were made to carry it. He could not read what the pattern said, if it said anything. He was not a scholar. He was a carpenter from Iran. He traced portions of the pattern onto a piece of paper he had in his work apron, intending to show it to someone who might know more than he did. He kept the tracing for several years. He eventually lost it in a move. What remains is his description of the pattern's general character. Lines that curved and intersected in a way he describes as organized, on iron that had been fabricated in Eiffel's workshop and installed according to specifications that showed no such feature on their drawings. The feature was not in the plans. The feature was on the iron. He spent 2 days establishing this to his own satisfaction before he accepted that what he was looking at was not a flaw in the manufacturing process and not a maintenance mark from the workshop, and not anything he could account for from what he knew about how iron was made and shaped in. The France of 1882. He told one colleague, a riveter named Bastien, whose last name he does not give. Bastien looked at it, said nothing useful, and returned to his work. Vollard does not know whether Bastien reported what he had seen to anyone. He himself did not report it. For a reason he states plainly in the dictated account, he did not know whom to report it to, or in what terms, or what he would have said. He had the vocabulary of a carpenter. What he had found required a different vocabulary, and by the time the copper was applied over the section of armature where the rib was located, he understood that it no longer mattered whether he reported it or not. The surface was sealed inside the structure. It would remain sealed there for as long as the statue stood. The corporate archive at Saclay contains one other document relevant to this account, and I want to describe it carefully because it sits in a different category from everything else I have found on this subject. It is a letter from Gustave Eiffel himself, dated June of 1883, addressed to a colleague at the École Polytechnique, whose name I recognize from the history of French materials science. The letter is about stress analysis. Eiffel was working on the calculations for the armature's long-term behavior under wind and thermal loading, and he was consulting with materials specialists about the properties of the iron alloy he had used. The letter is technical for most of its length. In its final paragraph, Eiffel writes that in the course of the construction work, he has become aware of certain features of the interior armature surfaces that were not the product of his fabrication process, and whose origin he has not been able to determine. And that he is mentioning this to his correspondent, because his correspondent has a broader knowledge of the properties of iron under various treatment and exposure conditions, and he asks whether his correspondent is aware of any process that would produce the surface features he is describing without deliberate human action. He does not describe the features in detail. He says they are on several interior faces and that they are consistent in character. He says he has had the relevant sections independently examined by 2 members of his engineering staff, and that neither could account for them by reference to the manufacturing specifications. He says he has decided that, as the features present no structural concern, they require no engineering response, and that he has not entered them into the construction record. He has decided he has not entered them into the construction record. Gustav Eiffel, writing to a colleague describing features on the interior of his most significant completed project that 2 qualified engineers could not account for, and choosing not to put them in the record because they presented no structural concern, and because he could not explain them, and could not afford the construction timeline to investigate what he could not explain. The inside of the Statue of Liberty has not been accessible to systematic interior inspection since 1886, when the structure was completed and dedicated. The interior has been entered for maintenance purposes and for the various restoration projects that have addressed the statue's condition over the past century. The most significant being the 1984-1986 restoration that replaced the deteriorated copper to iron connection points that Eiffel's design had allowed to corrode. During the 1984-1986 restoration, workers had access to sections of the interior armature that had not been closely examined since the original construction. The restoration project produced extensive documentation of the armature's condition. That documentation, in the files of the National Park Service, does not include any systematic record of the interior surfaces of the primary iron ribs. The surfaces that face other structural members and that are only accessible when adjacent scaffolding allows a worker to look across rather than along the member's axis. The restoration addressed what it was designed to address. It was not designed to look for what Henri Vollard had found. This story has a parallel that I cannot leave unmentioned. In 1989, 3 years after the restoration was completed, a National Park Service conservator named Margaret Ouellet was conducting a post-restoration condition assessment inside the statue and noted in her field report a feature on an interior face of the armature in the upper torso section that she described as anomalous surface patterning, origin unknown, requiring further evaluation. The field report is in the Park Service's Statue of Liberty archive in New York Harbor. The further evaluation noted in the report was apparently not conducted, or if it was, the results were not added to the field report file. Ouellet retired from the Park Service in 1997. I contacted her through a former colleague in 2021. She remembered the anomalous surface patterning. She said she had not described it further in the field report because she did not know how to describe it, and because the condition assessment she was conducting was a structural one, and the feature presented no structural concern. Those are Eiffel's words from 1883, spoken by a Park Service conservator in 1989 without any knowledge of Eiffel's letter. No structural concern. Not entered into the record. What was sealed inside the Statue of Liberty in 1883 is still sealed inside it. The copper skin that Frederick Auguste Bartholdi's craftsman applied over Eiffel's armature has been in place for more than 140 years, and the iron surfaces behind it have not been systematically examined since the inside men finished their work in the winter and spring of 1883, climbed down from their scaffolding, collected their wages, and were not retained for the exterior application work. Deliberately not retained. Henri Vollard went back to Rouen. He made furniture and repaired buildings for 40 years. He raised his children. In 1931, 6 weeks before he died, he dictated what he had seen inside the statue's iron frame to his daughter, who wrote it down and kept it, and whose granddaughter donated it to an archive in Lyon under a heading that did not say what it contained. He knew what he had seen was important. He had known it for 48 years. He just did not know, until the end, that writing it down was the thing he could do with it. If you know someone who has stood in the crown of the Statue of Liberty and looked at the iron ribs of the interior armature and wondered what the inside of that structure holds, not structurally, not mechanically, but in the way that things sealed for 140 years inside one of the most symbolic structures in the world hold things, share this with them. Vollard's account exists in Lyon. Eiffel's letter exists in Saclay. Ouellet's field report exists in New York Harbor. 3 independent observers, across 107 years, found the same feature on the same surfaces and reached the same conclusion. No structural concern. Not entered into the record.